Okay, hello everyone. It's great to be here and just to be sitting in a room with so many people coming from different backgrounds, trying to look at the way that art and science can be integrated. Specifically, I think at a time of ecological crisis, I think what this is actually adaptation for survival of our species. You know, when we start talking about environmental issues, often we think about a species that's disappearing somewhere far away. We're talking about the long-term survival of our species and what we want to try to save along with our own. So I'm going to shift over a little bit more to ecology. Now, I am not in neuroscience whatsoever, but I'm going to try to talk about experiences that I try to generate with participants through visual art, but also participatory biology. And I'll get into that, but before I jump into that, I wanted to show you this. Are any of you familiar with this book? No. The New Production of Knowledge, some of you. I think it's very relevant to what we're talking about today. This is, they came up with this idea in the 90s, and it really influenced, I think, citizen science, but it was a shift away from kind of what they considered mode 1 attitudes in science to mode 2 thinking, which is integration with people from different backgrounds. So it's kind of flipping it over in a sense so that we're looking at the fact that people have different backgrounds working together and trying to solve complex issues. So this is from '94. There's another one. Anybody heard of the term post-normal science? Okay, post-normal science. This is another one I think you'd be fascinated by, and really helpful. Because in this way, this is one of the big drivers for citizen science, but in other words, they're looking at exactly what we've been talking about, which is identifying a problem, which is complicated, exactly what Jerry was talking about, the big ball of worms, and trying to figure out how we can work together in temporary settings for research that involves not only artists, scientists, creative people, but also stakeholders, local members of a community, and getting their involved and their kind of knowledge, localized knowledge, indigenous knowledge, getting them involved. Anyway, so I wanted to throw those in. And if you look at what's written on the right, and then you compare it to this, so changes in science, but changes in art too. I mean, you have pioneers, we have pioneers like Helen and Newton here, who never thought, I mean, from talking to you all, never had this discussion about whether what they were really doing was art or science. They were solving problems, right? Looking at saying, we're here, this is the issue, how do we solve that problem? Not getting caught up in the terminology, not worrying too much about which discipline was going to impact this or that. But you see the same thing. And this, so for those of you interested in kind of eco-art or artists that are dealing with ecological interventions, this was a book that came out in 2002, which would be a really good primer. So there's a newer book that came out 2 years ago, 3 years ago now, called To Life, Eco-Art in Pursuit of a Sustainable Planet. It's also kind of a testimonial of artists that are doing kind of transdisciplinary work involving art, science, but really trying to tackle complex social and ecological problems. Okay, so social ecological problems. I'm just going to talk a little bit about my experiences working with lots of different members of the community, those amphibian communities as well as human communities. So as I said, I'm an amphibian biologist. I create art about these experiences, but I also work with the public a lot. I'm an environmental educator. I was brought into SVA in 2012 to help set up a level 1 biology laboratory in an art school. So there's a functioning biology laboratory there, though they're not producing any science research as of yet. It has that capacity. The other thing that I found fascinating is I was brought into the Humanities and Sciences department, and I've been teaching straightforward, like intro to biology courses, ecology, urban ecology, to art students, and they're hungry for it. The classes are totally maxed out, which is super encouraging, I think. So this idea, when I was asking the thing about academia earlier, I was trying to figure out where in the world these things are happening and if we can learn from those models and expand upon it. I've also been at McGill, but I won't really talk about that now. I'm just going to talk about frogs for a minute of propaganda, but also to give this some context. Amphibians, you know, talking about what I was just saying about this crisis of survival. I'm sure most of you know we're head on, we're kind of right in the middle of a mass extinction event where just plants and animals, organisms are disappearing thousands of times, hundreds to thousands of times faster than what you would naturally see occurring from what we've learned from the fossil record. So amphibians, it's a great group. Sadly, a great group to understand this phenomenon. Of the 7,000 known species, somewhere between 40 to 43% have disappeared probably in the past like half century. In fact, 200 species just in about 15 years. So it's really like an accelerated disappearance. So this is, for me, there's a moral imperative to be studying this group of animals. Now, you can look at this guy. So I hope all of you are very familiar with the development of amphibians and frogs and toads, but as you might know, tadpoles go from, they start in the water, they want to go to land. So you can see up here, there's 4 limbs, right? So those 4 limbs have emerged. It's still got a tail. What's missing? Any idea? What's that? Yeah, right there. Oh, this doesn't work on the screen. There should be 2 big, fat, juicy legs, right? So this is a little guy found in France. So this is my little niche that I study, amphibian limb development, looking at what's causing missing limbs, looking at what's causing extra limbs. And it's pretty forward scientific questions. You know, what are the underlying mechanisms that cause this? Secondly, what happens when you're finding too many of these in a singular ecosystem? Does that suggest ecological compromise? But the way I go about asking these questions is where it gets a little fuzzy. And so one of the big things is the field research. When you're studying amphibians, going out, doing these field investigations, doing population analysis, actually analyzing every frog and toad and salamander and little tiny different stages of development species you see, or different stages of development that we find. And then the way I do it is I do it with the public. So I literally try to train people to go out with me. And this is also about this experience. Has anyone read Edward Reed's The Necessity of Experience? Oh, that's another good one. Okay. Edward Reed, he was at Yale. Basically, and it directly relates to what you were saying with different parts of the brain. He was arguing that what's happening is as we're becoming more digitally interfaced with this kind of secondary, like, you know, this virtual reality, we're losing parts of our own ability to be human. Like, in other words, empathy is actually being lost because somehow we're living in this parallel reality. So it's very much about sensory based. So thinking about that, that's one of the things that I try to do, particularly with youth. Take them out on these field trips, get them immersed in the environment, but it's a way for them to learn their backyard in a way that perhaps they haven't anymore, or they haven't before. So this is from Ireland. You see, so it's all kinds of different groups of people. And then just getting them immersed in a wetland. And part of it is it's very like, this is France, of course, you can tell by the fashion. People wearing stilettos on field trips to ponds, it was awesome. But it's really this idea that, you know, looking at that green space in a very different way, becoming immersed in it, and what that does to you psychologically, and how that may invoke empathy for those ecosystems. And it's glamorous. You can do contests to see who can keep leeches on your face the longest. But in all seriousness, it's like, how do you try to get people involved with this kind of field research, which is hot, heavy research, time demanding. There's either no money or very little money involved. And one of the ways that I found is people are exhausted after these field trips, but I ask them to do art, you know, right along the way. You know, we're spending 8 to 10 hours a day out in the field. We bring all these art supplies, ask them to be drawing or sketching or recording, making their observations, just writing about their experience, so that it's literally, you kind of have to shift gear. On one hand, just the physical act of being there is very dynamic, like you feel it, right? But you're shifting over when you're analyzing the amphibians and looking at them. So you can feel the little gear shift in your brain, because then you have to focus in and try to be very objective and analytical. But then I ask people to shift back, so then they reflect on the whole experience. And what does this mean? What does it mean when you find a 12-legged frog? How does that make you feel? So again, that kind of connection of experience. And the other thing that I've been experimenting with is setting up working science laboratories in art museums. So this is like a field site in a museum or in an art center. So people are expecting to come see art, and they're literally walking into a working working, functioning bio laboratory with actual experiments going on. And then I get try to encourage people to volunteer, and this creates this whole like ability for people to communicate, to like look at what science research looks like, but also installation art. So it's really kind of crossing these boundaries or asking people to like form their opinions. So in England, most people saw the bio art lab that was at Yorkshire Sculpture Park as science, right? So even though it was in the context of a working, art center, they still saw it that way. And the other thing I'm interested in is, what do the people take away from this experience? What does it look like for people to be looking at actual research being done? And how do they feel about that? And there are art supplies there, and I try to get more volunteers. This is one from Canada. I like this one better in a sense because 73 people saw it as dually art and science, which is what I was kind of, when people ask me if it's art or science, I say yes. And again, I'm interested in whether or not visiting the laboratory can get people more engaged or interested in what's going on with amphibian populations in those communities. But then I mentioned that I asked people to make art in the field settings, but also the lab settings. So these are some of the volunteers. And these are these beautiful big photographs that were generated in the lab. So on one hand, we have to do all this very analytical work, but I'm asking people, take your time and explore what you want to explore with the materials that are on hand. So this is another, these are casts of some of the deformed frogs, or resin casts with poetry that she wrote in the background. It was beautiful installation. This was a media piece where these were some of the subject tadpoles, and they were swimming around on a sensor, and then it generated light, and the idea is that it changed back and forth at different times of the day, because with their life cycle, when they fed, they got really excited, and then that would change the kind of projection that happened. But in other words, these are the ways that the volunteers wanted to explore, my frog team. And this was part of an exhibition that they had, which was part of the kind of end. I always think that reward at the end, somehow closing the situation, and then this experience of acknowledging what you were able to produce. And then also, I'm creating art during this time. I'm doing the field work, but I need to somehow use the other part of my brain to explore the emotive side, the emotional side. So this is a process called clearing and staining. It's not an X-ray. We can talk about this later. It's about a 30-stage chemical process. So I'm doing this in the laboratory so people can see when it's happening too. It's under the hood, but it's still like you can see the different stages. And then these are photographs and scans. Usually now I integrate to both a flatbed scanner and photography and mix the two together and then create these prints, which are a little bit larger than this, but about this size, so that the frog is the size of a human toddler. That's the intention. I made them really big, and then they were scary, which I didn't want to create monsters. And then I made them really small, and people walked by, so psychologically they just didn't connect. But making them the size of a toddler, hopefully it invokes empathy, and then that whole conversation. But when you were talking about design earlier, one of the things that I'm really interested in is how can this be open-ended? I have my real desire to try to get people interested in amphibians and conservation, but I want this work of art just to speak for itself, or to try to like have a conversation with people, and also showing the actual specimens. So I try to set the stage, but I don't try to make it so illustrative. I just try to let people walk in and connect with it. And I've always been curious if that works. So this is like an example of one of the installations. So some of the prints, some video, and then showing the actual specimens on light boxes so that people have to like go in and have this intimate encounter with this preserved specimen. And hopefully that's connecting people. And then just out of curiosity, I decided to bug art administrators that had shown these works before. So over the course of about 7 years of showing these works, I managed to convince and irritate 38 curators, museum directors, and organizers into filling out these huge questionnaires and doing lots of writing. So it's like in typical biology, we use a lot of quantifiable data, right? So I was wanting to get qualifiable information from the arts to see if maybe showing these works was somehow effective. Did it change did just being in the experience of putting these shows together change their attitudes? And overwhelmingly, from the questionnaires, they said yes. And some of the writing that happened was really fantastic. almost out of time, but 81% said that it did increase their awareness of the declining amphibian issue. More than half of them said that exposure changed their attitude, and there were great stories about how it changed their behavior in daily activities. Thinking about things like pesticides differently in their yards, buying local and organic, and how you could connect that with a frog in your backyard. So, that's the kind of thing that I think is really interesting, how art can then, reach out and change, or how the experience of looking art can change behavior and what that can mean. Now, I know I was asked to write about, what was it, the outcome or the useful discoveries. Okay, so useful discoveries, that's really tricky. So I just wanted to say, in closing, some of the things that we've discovered from the kind of useful discoveries from these transdisciplinary programs. Anybody recognize this creature?
Stick bug?
Not a stick bug. I'll give you a hint, it's underwater. Even though it looks like it's outer space, it's like the creature from Aliens, right? It's a dragonfly nymph. So on some of these transdisciplinary field trips in England, we were out with a group of kids and lots of parents and volunteers, and we started noticing all these little toads that had limbs that were freshly chewed off. And then we also noticed that there were little circles in the kind of groups of tadpoles. A tadpole would be swimming along, it would just disappear, and then it would emerge a few minutes later, wobbling and being in a lot of pain. And we found these dragonfly nymphs were capturing the tadpoles, pulling them down into the mud, chewing off their limbs, and surprisingly, not only is it surprising they were just eating the legs, or statistically liking the legs a lot, the tadpoles were healing. So it offered an explanation for missing limbs in deformed frogs. So this we published in 2009, which now a dozen other, in my little niche community, it's really had an important impact, but it was discovered in part from art-science collaboration. And so we saw the whole range of developmental deformities from a natural cause. The next thing is I plugged that research into Quebec studies with different volunteers, and we saw the same thing happening with dragonfly larvae and other predators attacking tadpoles, nibbling off limbs. And so the next discovery that was fascinating is there are actually more predators at polluted farm pond sites. So farm ponds seem to be affecting the trophic pyramid, the food web, so that dragonfly larvae and some other predators are actually more prevalent in some of these sites versus nature reserve ponds. And so you still get higher levels of deformities. This is kind of where the research is at right now, but again, it's like we're asked, how can art science? It was directly through those observations made by volunteers with diverse backgrounds that we were able to find those little pieces of the puzzle which have helped the deformed amphibian community. So that's it for now, and thank you all very much. And if anybody wants